Hello. You can see from this slide that the learning objectives for this lesson are to be able to describe the structure and function of both carbohydrates and lipids. There are four different macromolecules that are important in the biological sciences. There are the carbohydrates and lipids, for which you'll be responsible today, and then proteins and nucleic acids, which we're going to go over during the next lesson. Now, think back to what we talked about last week with chemical bonds. If you're going to build a macromolecule, a large series of molecules that we talked about last week bonded together, or a polymer, is going to need to be strong. What type of chemical bond do you think would work best for building macromolecules? Hopefully you remembered that there are three major important bonds, which are covalent bonds, those are the sharing bonds, ionic bonds, those are the give-take bonds between atoms, and hydrogen bonds, which exist between molecules of water most generally. And you remember, hopefully, that the strongest ones are the covalent bonds, so they're going to be the most influential when we talk about polymers or the macromolecules in biology. So carbohydrates, or those carbs, those things that we love, are made mostly of three main atoms: carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. They are the primary fuel for organisms. Sugars, simple sugars, complex sugars, and even more complex carbohydrates are going to be the main sources of energy and a very important source of storage for this energy in living things. They also are an important component of the cellular structure, which you'll see when we go into the next chapter. And so chemical bonds to form and often to be destroyed take energy. You need to input energy to put carbons and hydrogens and oxygens together, and that energy is then stored in the chemical bond between them. When you rip those bonds apart, you release the energy and provide energy then for the organism doing this deconstruction of the macromolecules. So simple sugars are some of the most effective energy sources because you immediately get a lot of the energy stored in them. You don't have to take time to break apart the bonds between these polymers, between these monosaccharides. Mono means one, and saccharide refers to a sugar, so these are one sugar substances. And we can see a pentose, a pentagonal shape, in fructose, and glucose, which is important in table sugar, is hexagonal, and galactose, which is a milk sugar, is also hexagonal. So these monosaccharides, these one sugar substances, are going to be the most effective in terms of your energy right now when you need it. And for these, most of the energy that our body gets is going to be converted into glucose in some form. Glucose is, again, going to be very effective in terms of providing energy to our bodies, and so we will convert other substances or break them down into glucose to maximize the amount of energy that we get out of them. And so three different things can happen to this glucose once it winds up in the bloodstream. It can be released as energy right then. We can say, eat a candy bar, get energy. Eat an apple, get energy. Even drink milk, get energy. We can do that right then and get the energy immediately. Or it can get stored for later use. We have short-term storage. In humans, that is glycogen. It's sometimes referred to as animal starch, and that's generally going to be stored in our liver or in our muscles. And we have long-term storage, which many of us know is stored as fat in various places on the body. Glycogen, looking at that animal starch, the short-term storage, is a polysaccharide. So monosaccharide was one sugar. A polysaccharide is many sugars. The prefix poly refers to many. And there are thousands of glucose molecules that are all bonded together. So if you take one and then another glucose and you bond them one next to the other, we're going to get a glycogen molecule. And you can see from the two H's and the O, that we have one one water molecule right here. We have another molecule here. Generally, there'll be as many as 4 water molecules bonded within each of these glucose molecules to construct the glycogen. So think about these questions, pause the video and answer them, and when you're ready, come back to the video. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to think about why is it that dieters lose a large amount of what we call water weight during those first few days of dieting, right? You start your diet, you do great, you lose lots of weight, and then it gets really super frustrating for a long time. Why is that? Well, as the glycogen, as those short-term storage molecules break down, the water attached to them is also released, and so you lose a lot of weight rapidly, but once that short-term storage is gone after a couple of days, then you're having to break down the fats, and that's a much more difficult situation. And if you're sitting down eating a candy bar, probably it's going to be stored. You're not going to need a lot of energy if you're just sitting. So both short-term and long-term storage, depending on your reserves. So as we look at complex carbohydrates, their energy that's stored with different length times for which it's going to be released. We get the monosaccharides, the one sugars. We get disaccharides, and di as a prefix means two, so we get things like sucrose, which is 2 glucose molecules bonded together. We get things like lactose, which is a glucose and a galactose, and those are our simple sugars. And then we have the polysaccharides, the starches, or animal starches like glycogen, and these are complex carbohydrates. And so as we either take a disaccharide and break the bond, or take a polysaccharide and break the bond between each of the glucose molecules, and then when we take the glucose molecule itself and break the bonds apart, we're each time releasing energy. So again, starches are generally hundreds to hundreds of thousands of glucose molecules all joined together. Examples of them include barley and wheat and rye, corn, rice, oats, all the things like pasta, the things that we enjoy. And depending on the structure, carbohydrates can lead to either quick energy bursts or slow, persistent increases in energy as they release sugar into the blood, as they increase our blood sugar. So as you see, simple sugars like sugar, table sugar, or white breads, white pastas, fruit juices, they're going to, within the span of just 10 minutes, very rapidly give an increase in energy, and then just as rapidly it's going to go away. Whereas with more complex carbohydrates, which you can see in sort of the darker orange, it's going to take more like 30 to 40 minutes to get the maximum amount of energy out, and then it's going to more slowly taper. Whereas proteins, which of course are not going to be discussed until next week, are going to take even longer and produce more energy than the complex carbohydrates and persist over a longer period of time. And proteins mixed with carbohydrates are going to take the longest time to provide the amount of energy, are going to provide more energy than anything other than the simple sugars, and are going to persist for a much longer period of time. So depending on the type of energy that you need and the duration over which you're going to need it, you can consume different products. And of course, not all carbohydrates are digestible, and particularly not digestible to humans. So chitin, some of the woody parts of woody plants, and the exoskeleton of arthropods, we tend not to eat insects very much, but many of us do enjoy shrimp or lobsters, crawfish, and while we can consume many different types of carbohydrate, we cannot consume the chitin which makes up their shell. We also cannot digest cellulose. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't eat cellulose. The rough fibers are an important part of our diet. They just don't provide nutritional value because our bodies cannot digest them. So why do we eat these fibers, this roughage, if we cannot digest it? Well, there are other values that these products can have for our bodies. You may have heard that, a clean colon is a happy colon, and one thing that it can do is kind of cleanse the system. And it's good for preventing or reducing the threat of colon cancer. And you can kind of think of other benefits, termites in terms of an ecological role. They're going to rely on microorganisms, different bacteria that live in their gut, which help them eat wood substances and woody fibers. Actually, the termite themselves are not able to digest cellulose any better than we can, but because they have this symbiosis, this relationship with the microorganisms in their gut, they are able jointly to consume it. And that's an important role. I mean, we don't like them in our homes, but they certainly ecologically provide a very important role of decomposition of these woody plants. So think about these 3 questions. If you're tired and you need to stay awake right now, what would a good food choice be? Why do marathon runners carb load? Why do they eat lots of starchy foods right before a race or a couple of days before a race? And if we get little to no nutrition out of things like celery, why do we bother eating it? So think about these and then come back. Okay, so hopefully you've had time to think about it, and here are some of those answers. If you're not sure still why these are the correct answers, feel free to Sally, email, or ask me in class.